My name is Lauren Fordyce. I'm the Urban and Community IPM Educator with UC IPM, and we thank you for joining us today. So we are excited to have presenting today Igor Lacan. Igor is a University of California Cooperative Extension Advisor in the San Francisco Bay Area, specializing in urban forestry. His research focuses on trees and water, exploring emerging issues in urban landscapes such as tree growth in stormwater facilities, as well as long-standing problems such as wood decay and failure in urban trees. We're grateful to have you join us today, Igor. You can now begin sharing your slides.
So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will cover briefly some of the common wood decay fungi that we see on standing trees. And for more information, you can consult a guide to wood decay fungi, which we created last year, and you can download it on my website that's listed here. And so for this presentation, we will have roughly 4 parts. We'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the guide and the structure and the audience, and also some important limitations. Whenever we talk about wood decay fungi, there is potential for tree failure, and by failure I mean breakage, collapse, uprooting of the tree. And so we do need to cover some of the very important limitations of these kinds of guides and this type of information. Then we'll talk about wood decay concepts, because I think it's useful, that is useful in understanding how these fungi actually operate and why you might want to pay attention to them. Then we'll talk about some of the common fungi. I will not cover all of them, so the guide includes more fungi than I will show you today. But if you have a specific question, let me know, and we probably have a slide about it as well. So we got 4 elements, so let's start with the purpose of the guide. We're really talking about wood decay fungi on standing trees, which means we're not talking about most of the fungi you're going to see on standing trees. Fungi cause a vast variety of conditions, diseases, and changes on trees. That's not what we're covering. We're covering really just one small subset of all of the fungi you're going to see out there, and these are wood decay fungi. And our goal is to provide very basic information and how they interact with trees. And one of the ideas here is that there's not a whole lot of research out there that tells us how concerned we should be when we see one of these fungi on our tree. So we interviewed essentially a set of experts, and based on those interviews, we produced this rather subjective thing called the level of concern. So when you see that, just remember, it really is a subjective rating, and you will need to consult an arborist if you're concerned about a specific fungus on a specific tree. And so, just continuing with these limitations, the guide was really written for non-specialists, and this presentation is designed the same way as well. And as I mentioned, you will see many more fungi than I'm going to cover here. And even so, we probably even missed some of the ones in the guide. So this is focused on California, and this is sort of interesting. The same fungus can have somewhat different effects based on the tree it is found on and based on the environment it's found in. So some of the fungal species that we're not very concerned here in California, people are concerned about back on the east coast of the US. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. This is really somewhat California specific. And we, again, attempted to cover most common situations, but a couple of major caveats. This is not a risk assessment guide. If you need a tree risk assessment guide, this is not it. This can inform tree risk assessment, but it is not in and of itself a risk assessment guide. And the other thing is, please don't eat any of these fungi. Some of them are edible, and in fact, some of them are delicious, but unless you know exactly what you're doing, don't eat them, and you will not get enough information from this guide on that. So we're not talking about edibility of any of this. But the sort of bottom line is that presence of any of these fungi on a tree indicates that there is at least a little bit of wood decay inside the tree. So that's sort of the takeaway point. And then if you are concerned about the structural stability of the tree, you will need to consult with a qualified professional arborist, and we'll cover what that means at the very end of the presentation. So now let's just start with some basic wood decay concepts. What are we talking about? Well, remember what trees look like? Most of the living tissues of the tree are on the outside of that tree trunk or branch, just under the bark. There's this layer called the cambium. In this case, it's shaded red. That's the layer of living cells that is dividing and is allowing the tree to grow in girth. So that really is what makes a tree, is that cambium layer. And as the cambium layer grows, on the outside it forms the phloem, which is one of the two vascular tissues of the tree. Phloem is used to move sugars and solutes into the trunk and the roots. And again, as that same cambium layer grows, on the inside of it, it creates xylem, which is the other vascular system of the tree, which moves water from the roots up to the leaves. As the cambium continues to grow, it leaves behind that xylem. And so eventually that becomes wood. So all wood is abandoned xylem that was at one point functioning as a water conducting tissue, but as the tree grew, that was left behind on the inside and was chemically changed and became wood. That's our target for today, because we're talking about fungi that specialize in degrading wood. Now, it turns out there's two kinds of wood in most trees, not all, but in most trees there is the recently formed wood or sapwood. So this was just recently formed, maybe this year or last year. And the thing to remember about sapwood is that the tree is still able to move chemicals in and out of sapwood. Sapwood is not living in the same way that cambium is living. Sapwood is not actively dividing, it's not actively carrying out metabolic processes, but the tree has some access to it. So if sapwood gets attacked by a fungus, the tree has some ability to move chemicals into the sapwood to defend it. In contrast, heartwood, which is on the inside of the tree, is metabolically inactive. So, and you can actually sometimes see the difference in color. Again, not always. You can see the difference in color because the tree has moved additional chemicals into the heartwood to prevent or delay fungal attack. But once that fungal attack occurs, the tree doesn't have any active ways of managing it. It's really relying on those pre-stored chemical defenses in the heartwood. So you can see right away that there's two places where wood decay can occur. It can occur in the heartwood, which we call heart rot, or it can occur in sapwood, and we call that sap rot. Heart rot is very, very common. In older trees, there's frequently at least a little bit of wood decay in the center of the tree, and we know that a lot of our old trees are frequently hollow. And the reason that doesn't really impede the biology of the tree is because, remember, the actual metabolic functions and growth occur at this very edge under the bark, right? So heart rot, by definition, is not really a pathological thing. It's not really a kind of pathogen of some kind. It's simply that these fungi are slowly decaying this previously inactive wood in the center of the tree. And most of those fungi will have a great deal of trouble breaking out of the heartwood because, again, that next layer, the sapwood, is actively defended by the tree. In contrast, sap rot does exactly what the name implies. It affects the outer layer of wood. It's a little bit less common, but the thing to remember here is that because that layer of wood is still somewhat metabolically active, the fungi that are capable of causing sap rot have to either attack sapwood that has been in some way damaged or killed, or they have to be at least a little bit pathogenic because they have to overcome some of these tree defenses. Now, in practical terms, the reason this matters is because of strength loss. So we know that in a column, in a columnar shape, the forces are concentrated on the outer edge of the column. This is why we can have cans. For example, if you think of a Coke can or something like that, it's actually quite strong because that outer wall is intact. That means that with heart rot, we observe relatively little strength loss until the heart rot really expands greatly and breaches the outer wall, which can take many, many years, or it can maybe not happen at all, right? We can have 100-year-old trees that are hollow, standing up perfectly fine. In contrast with sap rot, because the damage is to the outer edge of that tree trunk, we experience very high strength loss. So here's an example of a comparison. If you have 2 inches worth of decayed wood, and you can arrange it however you want, does it matter for strength loss? It turns out it matters a great deal. If you put those 2 inches around the center and you end up with a 4-inch wide decay column, you lose well under 1% of that wood strength. Whereas if you take those same 2 inches and you just arrange them around the perimeter of the tree, effectively sap rot, now you've lost 1/3 of the strength of that branch. So when we go into that fungal discussion, just keep in mind, sap rot typically is more of a cause for concern, even though most of what we're going to see are going to be heart rots. The other thing to consider is what part of the wood is actually being decayed. Wood is made up mostly, almost entirely, of 2 chemicals, cellulose and lignin. So wood is the original composite material. And the reason wood works so well is that these 2 chemicals have very different mechanical properties. So cellulose resists tension. Here's a piece of paper, and I'm pulling on the piece of paper, and nothing happens. That paper is made almost entirely of cellulose. In contrast, lignin is the firm part of the tree. So cellulose has no capacity to resist compression. If I push on it, it just bends. Whereas if I take a pencil that's made of wood, I can push on that pencil. The reason it resists compression is because of lignin. So it turns out fungi specialize. They either prefer eating cellulose or they prefer eating lignin. Some of them do both, but they'll start with one and then move on to the other. And so if we start by degrading cellulose, the material that gives us strength and tension, we're left with lignin, and we call this brown rot because lignin is brown. So it's named after what is left behind. And this will result in brittle fractures or brittle failures. It's kind of like dropping a porcelain cup. If you think of a porcelain cup, there is no elasticity to it. So that's a brown rot. Most of the fungi we're going to talk about are not actually going to be brown rot, but brown rots are interesting in that it's very hard to see when this kind of decay has occurred, and the consequences tend to be this kind of very brittle, sudden failure. In contrast, fungi that eat lignin leave behind cellulose. Cellulose is white. We call that white rot. And in this case, the failure is ductile. It's kind of like slowly tearing a piece of paper. You would end up with those jagged, stringy edges. And we call that white rot. Most of the fungi we're going to talk about today will be white rot fungi. Eventually, they will eat lignin as well, but it's really, eventually they'll eat cellulose as well, but they start with lignin. So the final thing final introductory thing is, what is it we're actually looking at when we see something growing out of the tree? We're seeing a conch. A conch is the reproductive structure of that fungus, and they come in all shapes and sizes, and I'll show you a number of them. They're great to look at. But the thing to remember is this is not the whole fungus. In fact, this is not even most of the fungus. Most of the fungus is inside the tree, right? Degrading either cellulose or lignin. This is simply its reproductive structure. This is how they get around. So to sum up, the wood decay fungi live inside of trees, and they will eventually produce this reproductive structure. Some of them may not, for years, produce reproductive structure. Conchs themselves can be fleshy or hard. They can be perennial, persist for many years, or they can be annual, which they shrivel up and die every year. The thing about conchs is and wood decay fungi in general, there's really no way to eradicate them. And they're actually important parts of the ecosystem. We're skipping a large part of the story of wood decay fungi, which is they are the cleanup crew of our forests. They are what degrades wood and returns that material to the soil. So without them, we would be knee-high in undecomposed wood. And as far as conchs go, I don't like to remove conchs because to me they serve as a friendly reminder that there's something going on inside the tree. So here's a great image that I actually snapped at a botanical garden, and you can see this beautiful conch on a cherry. And what's going on is the concerning part is actually going on inside the tree. And the conch is simply a reminder there's something going on inside the tree. So we covered the locations of wood decay, sap rot and heart rot. We covered types of wood decay, brown rot versus white rot. And then we covered what it is we're going to be looking at, which is conchs or reproductive structures of the tree. Just remember the real action is inside of the tree. Conch is just telling you that something's happened. So let's look at some of the common fungi. And as we do that, I'll use this term level of concern. And again, I want to stress that this is very much a subjective concept where we're trying to guide people toward their next step. So if we say a fungi causes very high level of concern, we would suggest that you'd want to take action fairly quickly. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, limited level of concern, we recommend monitoring because again, you do have at least a little bit of wood decay in that tree. Otherwise you wouldn't have the conch. But there's not a clear causal link between that species of fungus and extensive wood decay. And by the way, we are more confident in the very high and high level of concern than we are with the lower levels of concern. So where we say prompt action recommended on the very high level of concern, we're pretty confident that is in fact what should be happening. So what kind of fungi would cause us to be very concerned? Mostly sap-rotting fungi. And remember, sap rot causes a great deal of strength loss, but it also indicates that the tree part you're seeing it on is at least partially dead. Otherwise, you wouldn't have sap rot. So let me show you a typical example. These are tar balls or cramp balls, annulohypoxylon. They used to be called hypoxylon, but I think the taxonomists decided that that wasn't hard enough to pronounce, so they renamed it to annulohypoxylon. That's a joke. And this is what they look like, very much like a black golf ball sticking out of a tree. And these are all across California. They have these small bumps on the edge of the fungus. They're very distinct looking. This is a pretty good indication that whatever you're looking at is dead. So if you're looking at a large branch like this, that branch is dead. If you're looking at a trunk like this, good indication that that trunk is dead. These are frequently seen with sudden oak death in Northern California, and they're a good indication that that tree is very unlikely to recover, and in fact is very likely to eventually fail. So you want to take some kind of action. The cramp balls or tar balls. So next we have split gill fungus or schizophilum. This is very frequently seen on just wood lying on the ground, and these are these fuzzy leathery things. If you look underneath, you'll see that this is a typical gill fungus. So it has the gill structure on the bottom, and they fork, they split. A single gill splits into two. It's very distinctive. Again, same deal as with hypoxylon. It's a good bet that whatever you're looking at is at least in part dead. And this very frequently occurs on small branches that are about to be shed. And you see a small dead branch and you see these on the branch. It's time to maybe cut that off. The next level of concern down would be the high level of concern. Now, this includes both sap rots and heart rots, and it actually includes one or a few brown rots that we're going to discuss today, specifically this one. And here we have at least some evidence that when you see these conchs on a tree, you may have pretty substantive wood decay inside of the tree. So this is something where you'd really want to investigate the situation further. So let me show you a couple of examples here. One of my favorite mushrooms, oyster mushrooms. I've said that you should not use this guide to determine edibility, but if you've been to a farmer's market, you've probably seen these mushrooms. They are fleshy, they're soft, they do not persist on the tree. They start out white and then they turn gradually darker color, gray, brown, and eventually shrivel up. And they're very common. They're very common on things like eucalyptus, on oaks, and really anywhere those trees occur. So when you look at these little distribution maps, you can see that it's present across the state and it is present in urban areas. So this would be one of those where you really want to consider further evaluation because this is a white rot that typically occurs in trees that are at the end of their lifespan or trees that have been injured by something else. Now, for our star brown rot, sulfur shelf, latiparus, and by the way, I'm using common names because scientific names tend to both tend to change a little bit, and they tend to be slightly different depending on the region where you are. So what we're calling sulfur shelf actually has at least two scientific names, and you can go and argue whether it is a separate species or whether it's a single species that has different forms, or whether it's a single species that just got renamed. So that's why I'm sticking with common names. These are very spectacular, it can be very spectacular, bright yellow color that then unfortunately fades into this kind of beige and eventually dark and they go away. These are again perishable, so to say. And this definitely warrants further information because remember, this is a heart rot that causes brown rot. So it has degraded cellulose and you're left just with that brittle lignin, and that's one way that brittle failures occur. So you would want to have that tree examined further. But this is certainly a beautiful, brilliant fungus to look at. Very common on eucalyptus, by the way. So there's more of it. And again, you'd want to have the tree evaluated. Another example of one of these conchs that are fairly common is the varnished conch. Now, depending on where you are in the US, it's going to be Ganoderma lucidum, Ganoderma polychromum. And we'll have more Ganoderma species of fungi later on. This is the one that looks like it has a shiny polished nail on top of it. It's really striking. It looks like somebody took a thing of lacquer and lacquered it. It is shiny, it is polished, it's really interesting looking. These are slightly more persistent, the conchs, so you will see them for some time. And they mostly occur on the base of the tree. The fungi I talked about previously can occur just about anywhere on the tree. These will usually be around the base of the tree. They are white rots. They are thought to indicate at least some internal decay, and so you would want to have the tree evaluated. These are common on oaks, but they're also common on pines, so they occur both on evergreens and on conifers. In the guide, we have several keys to these fungi, so you can follow whichever key makes sense for you. So we have a key, for example, that asks you, are you looking at conifers? Well, then this is your more common fungi. Or are you looking at broadleaf trees? Well, then this is your more common fungi. This is, in fact, this shows up on both. So then let me kind of give you a couple of examples of the moderate and limited level of concerns. And this is essentially fungi for which we have less evidence linking them to extensive decay. And again, I am talking about California. If you consult some of the literature from the eastern United States, you will see a somewhat different assessment. So again, I'm stressing this California specific situation. So let's start with the moderate level of concern. And this is my favorite fungus, if anybody was wondering, the artist's conch, which we think is probably Ganoderma applanatum, but again, it's good to stick with common names in this case. The artist's conch is called that because it has this bright white pore surface. This is where pores are discharged. That's most of these fungi function the same way. They'll discharge pores from the lower surface. But in this case, this is slightly soft. And if you want, you can write on it with any kind of hard object. You could use a pen, but you could also just use your fingernail or use really anything at all. You can scratch in your name or the name of your friend or anybody you want to embarrass. And the good news is that pore surface gets renewed every few weeks. So when you come back a couple of months later, it'll be gone. So it's something fun to do if you have this on your tree. But again, there is some level of concern here because this is a wood decay fungus. It is a white rot, mostly around the base of the tree, sometimes can go a little bit higher up. They can get enormous. They can get quite big enough for you to stand on. And these are perennial. So and you can see the yearly growth increment. They're like layers of a layer cake. They keep adding, so they keep getting bigger over the years. They are associated with some failures, so you do want to have the tree evaluated. But again, that link is not as strong in California as it is on the East Coast, and they're found all over the state. They're very, very common, and again, at least for me, they're my favorite fungus. And these are woody, so both the Ganoderma polychromum, we just covered the lacquered one, and this one are woody. They're hard, woody things. In contrast, our next fungus is lion's mane, Hericium. This is a soft, fleshy thing, kind of fuzzy almost. There's a reason why they call it the lion's mane. These are frequently associated with a cavity. In fact, if you want to try to find one, I would say look for trees that have large holes, large cavities like this, and then look inside the cavity. They might be inside or they might be hanging out just on the edge. So normally the level of concern is somewhat limited, but if it's associated with cavity, then you have that combination of a cavity and a fungus that brings it up to a higher level of concern. These do fade into a kind of brown mess with age. Again, this is soft. These are fairly perishable, so they will go away after a few weeks. Again, we're not talking about edibility, but some people have said that these are quite delicious when they're young, but we're not talking about edibility. So let me show you another one. This is a weeping conch, Inonotus or Pseudo-Inonotus dreaedus. Very striking when it does this because it does seem to weep this kind of amber-colored liquid. It is very striking when it does that. It doesn't always do that. So sometimes it's just a sort of boring beige color. These tend to be interesting. They can be very large. They can be persistent for a number of years. They will kind of persist in this dried fashion. They're limited concern except if you find it on a conifer that's in a very windy location. Then it has been associated with some tree failures, and they're very common on the north coast of California. But they're also reasonably common on coast live oaks that are planted in ornamental situations or residential situations, college campuses, parks, and so on. You would want to at least keep an eye on what's happening here, because again, it has been associated with failures in windy locations. So that's all I've got. I do have quite a few more slides, but we'll stop here and we'll talk about where to go next. And then when we have questions, we can come back and talk about other fungi. I'm happy to show you more slides with more fungi. So let me show you a couple of resources because I think this is useful, and let me talk about how you would work with an arborist given this information. So again, you can go to my website and download the guide. It has a number of more fungi, but you can also check out the work from Jesse Glazer and Dr. Kevin Smith of the U.S. Forest Service, who have published multiple pamphlets on decay fungi of trees. And these are available on Dr. Smith's U.S. Forest Service's website. So this is very, very accessible. It's all there. Highly recommended, beautiful pictures. There is, of course, our own pest note on wood decay fungi and landscape trees by Jim Downer. That is on the UC IPM website. And then finally, if you are really interested, the U.S. Forest Service has an entire forest insect and disease training manual that's online that is also freely accessible. I think all of these that I've listed can be found online. So if you're interested, highly recommend it. We do have training videos, which will be posted on my website in a couple of days. And there are 3 modules, really 4, but I think for fungi, you would want to cover the first 3. They cover this lecture, and they cover all of the all of the fungi that are in the guide. So we go into a bit more detail, especially the fungi that are common on conifers. The next thing I want to cover is where do you go next? And so if you have a tree and you have a fungus growing on it and you've decided that you are concerned about that, what would you do? Well, you would probably want to hire an arborist. Now, arborists come in two basic flavors. Those who work for tree care companies and those who just do consulting, in other words, who work typically for themselves or for a small consulting company. And the difference is that at a consulting arborist, you're paying for their time. So you're paying for their time to give you a recommendation, answer a question, or provide some kind of a management plan for your tree. Tree care company, you're typically paying for the company to actually do the work on your tree. In either case, you want to look for, at the very least, an ISA certification, which looks like this, ISA Certified Arborist. Most consultants will also be ASCA registered consulting arborists. And just about everybody who is ASCA registered will also hold an ISA certification. But at a very minimum, you want an ISA certification. Now, if you're concerned about tree failure, which means exactly what you think it means, which is breakage, uprooting, or something falling down, then you probably want the arborist to also hold something called the TRAC qualification. That comes on top of their certification. TRAC is Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, and it means that the arborist has had some continuing education specifically in assessing the potential of that tree to break or fail. So the next thing is, all right, you're going to hire somebody. What are you going to ask them to do? Well, there is such a thing as a formal tree risk assessment. And this is not the same thing as a tree evaluation. Somebody coming out, looking at your tree and saying, oh, I see problem like over here. I see some, branches that need to be pruned. I see some, pests that need to be addressed, all that. That's not really a formal tree risk assessment. A formal tree risk assessment actually involves you, the tree owner, to some degree, because you will need to tell the risk assessor what it is you're concerned about. So you're concerned about a big tree limb falling on your garage, or you're concerned about the whole tree tipping over and hitting your house. That's actually the part of identifying targets. And then the arborist, the risk assessor, will decide which kind of failure types they're going to assess and what time frame. But so this is going to involve you a bit more than a standard tree report, and it will cost you more than a standard tree report. So you want to talk to your arborist and say, I am looking for a tree risk assessment. Can you provide one? Yes. Okay, let's talk about what it'll include. So one of the decisions is, do you need one of these? Well, if you're not concerned about the tree failing, maybe you don't need a tree risk assessment. Maybe if you're seeing a fungus, all you need is an evaluation and a tree condition report, kind of a tree health report card. The trade-offs are that's not going to perhaps provide information if you are concerned about the tree failing, but it's going to cost less. And that might be all you really need. Finally, there is the issue of liability. Typically, if you're the owner of a tree, you are liable to at least some extent for what happens to that tree. So again, if you're concerned, if you're doing this in an urban area where someone else might be affected, you probably do want to ask for that tree risk assessment and pay the fee. And then you can discuss management options with your arborists. And I'll show you some of the resources on tree hazards as well. In fact, we have one at the Cooperative Extension. ANR has the Inspect Your Landscape Trees for Hazards publication, which is great. We have a more detailed publication, which is recognizing tree hazards, and you will see the fungi listed in there as one of the things to look for. And then, of course, there is more information on pruning. This is from the University of Florida, especially for young trees where you want to set them up to grow into a strong structure. But also then there is the information on how to find arborists. Again, you want that certification. You really want that certification if you're going to hire somebody to assess risk. I do have the photo citations. They are here, so I'll leave them here for just a second, and we have at least 2 pages of photo citations. And then I will go on to my final slide. I'm happy to take questions, or I'm happy to talk about more fungi if you'd like. Everybody know what fungus this is? You've seen it before. This is my favorite fungus, the artist's conch. So I'll leave it here, and I'll turn it back to my hosts to tell me if there are any questions, or if we just want to go back and look at some more fungi pictures. Happy to do that. Armillaria is one of the very, very few wood decay fungi that are able to kill cambium and degrade wood. So armillaria is pathogenic, and then when it's kind of gone through cambium, then it can go into the wood and degrade wood. This is very unusual. Most of these fungi are not able to do that. So it has high level of concern because it is able to essentially kill the tree, especially with repeated infestation year after year after year. It will is a strong word, it may cause the death of that tree, and then it will just stay there and eat the wood. Very common with oaks. Yes, it can be misidentified, but again, if you have these very large clusters of mushrooms, it's a good bet that it's armillaria. The problem is, in many cases, they don't form these beautiful clusters. It's just 1 or 2, and then it's much harder to kind of identify it. Very common on oaks and really common across the state. Once that infestation is a little bit further advanced, because remember, it's killing the cambium, it's killing the living tissue, the tree canopy begins to kind of thin out and die back. And so if you have a combination of a bunch of these honey-colored mushrooms at the base of an oak with a thinning, dying canopy, yes, that is then reason for concern, and you would want to have that tree evaluated. But again, this is this is a somewhat unusual fungus. Interestingly, if you then cut down the tree and chip the tree, the armillaria doesn't do well in those wood chips. It gets eaten. So other fungi come in, trichoderma, for example, and just eat it. So this is, again, that fascinating ecosystem level consideration. But yeah, that's armillaria. Good question. Good question. All right, let's look at some other fungi that we didn't see. How about one of the more conifer-based ones? How about Fomitopsis, or red belt fungus? And you can see right away that it's more common in the wetter areas of the state. And it has that bright red margin, beautiful sort of hoof-like shape right there. Again, the red band unfortunately kind of fades with age, and you can see that, but they're pretty distinctive looking. And again, these are mostly on conifers. Really, really pretty, kind of just looks like somebody stuck a hoof onto a tree. Very distinctive. What else we got? Quinine, Loriciformis. These are somewhat less common, but again, conifers, and you can see people think fungi only stay down by the base. Not at all. These will show up way up in the tree. And again, reasonably high level of concern because you're usually looking at a fairly old tree, but these really are specific to conifers. We talked about armillaria. I hope everybody was excited about that. We talked about sulfur shelf. We talked about our varnish conch friend. How about a phaeolus, a velvet top? This is actually more common than people think, but they fade into this kind of mass of nothingness. They are velvety. They're kind of a fuzzy, velvety conchs. Nothing else really looks like them, and they're typically close to the tree. We would recommend follow-up, especially if you are somewhere where you have wind or concern from weather, especially. This is typically where we see them on conifers that have failed from wind throw.
All right, well, thank you very much for a very fun and engaging presentation.